Okay, everybody, welcome to part 2 of our talk on multicellularity and how to make a multicellular organism. And so in the previous video, this is the slide we ended on because we talked about single cell organisms and how they communicated with one another, and then how that was passed on to multicellular organisms. So multicellular organisms function at the cellular level. Cells then can also group up to produce tissues, which have similar structure and function, and we can function at the tissue level. The tissues then can group up to form organs. We can function at the organ level, and then our organs cooperate with other organs to form organ systems. And so we function at the organ system level, and different organ systems then produce the organism. So remember that we learned with single cell organisms, let me put my laser pointer back on, that single cell organisms have to get their nutrients and things from the external environment. And so our cells, so do multicellular organisms. We still have to provide the nutrients and the gases needed for those cells to do work. Okay, and then when those cells are doing work, and what I mean by work is chemical reactions, right? They produce waste products. And so we have to get rid of the waste products and put those back out into the atmosphere. So remember that single-celled organisms live in water. They usually live in either a freshwater or a marine environment. Okay, and so their cell membranes all come in contact with the watery external environment, and that's where the oxygen is, and they can have oxygen diffuse across that cell membrane. They can get nutrients and bring those in. They can take waste products from inside, have it diffuse across their cell membrane, and get right out into the external environment. Okay, very efficient situation going on there. Our cells don't have access, not all of them, to the external environment. And even those that do, like our cells in our skin, the external environment is the air. But water is very important for transporting these things across cell membranes. So we needed to multicellularity organisms, as they became more complex and they started producing thick tissues. So again, here might be the external environment, but how are these cells in the middle going to get what they need? Okay, it may not be enough by the time it gets transported through all of these cells. Okay, so we needed to solve a problem there. And so what happened through the problem-solving process of evolution is that we started to make fluid compartments within our bodies. Okay, so we have actual body compartments that are separated from one another and form these, we put fluid in there. So we kind of like make our own ocean inside of our body. And what we do is with these fluid compartments, we fill it with nutrients. We fill it with the oxygen that we need. Okay, and then that fluid comes in contact with our cells. And then that can, with the water, can exchange that fluid into our cells. And then our cells, the waste products can be put into that fluid. And now we can move the fluid to carry the wastes away. Okay, so we need water to exchange molecular nutrients and gases and wastes and things like that. Okay, so that's how we know about life on Earth. That's what's needed on Earth. So water is necessary because water is the solvent where chemical reactions take place. And it's also that transport vehicle. So molecules can dissolve in it and it can move within the water and it can get transported across cell membranes. So really, this is a major portion of any animal's body mass. A large part of it is water because, again, we had to create our own watery medium inside the body in order for water to touch every cell within our body. Here's what that might look like, a real simple view. Here's a cell, right? Here's outside of the cell. And then here's another fluid compartment. So there's 3 compartments here. So this is the intracellular fluid, okay? And so this is the fluid that is within a cell and it's bounded by a cell membrane, Okay. Then there's fluid traveling through blood vessels. That's also bound by cells that have membranes, so that keeps this compartment filled with fluid, and the fluid, main portion of our blood, is the plasma. And then the space outside of our blood cells and outside of our cells is the interstitial fluid. Okay, so there's fluid surrounding our cells and surrounding our blood vessels. So fluid inside of the cell, again, is intracellular fluid, and that's the cytoplasm. Any fluid outside of the cell is called the extracellular fluid, and that's separated into the plasma and the interstitial fluid. Okay? Now, these aren't static compartments. Fluid can flow between each of these compartments. And that's exactly what it does. That's how we replenish the fluid, and that's how we bring nutrients into the fluid and carry waste away. Okay, so I'm showing you with the blood vessel a more complex organism. So we're going to do a stepwise. Not all organisms have all of these body fluid compartments, but they do have a fluid compartment. Okay, so again, solutes get dissolved in there, and then the water can help transport them. Okay. All right. So those compartments are formed within what are called body cavities. That's the solution to distributing water to all the cells. Create these body cavities to store water internally, and that helps distribute the nutrients, can protect our, gives a cushioning effect to our internal organs. It can be used as support within the body. That's called a hydrostatic skeleton. So there are some animals that don't have a skeleton at all, but they have a real packed body fluid compartment, and that helps to form structure from the inside out. Okay. So the different types of body cavities, there's 3 main types. And then we're going to see again, those are going to differentiate into other organisms. We can actually separate Animalia into one of these 3 types. There are some that actually don't have a fluid-filled cavity. They're some of the smallest Animalia organisms, and they're just tissue. But again, within cells, there's fluid, so the compartment is actually within the cells themselves. So instead of having a cavity, we call that a coelomate organism. Acoelomate organism. Acoelomate. A coelom is a cavity. Okay, so if you don't have a coelom, that's called acoelomate. Okay, another one is called pseudocoelomate. It means it's a body cavity, but it's lacking some of the lining of the tissues. Or we have a situation called true coelom. Okay, so an organism either is acoelomate, pseudocoelomate, or coelomate. Okay, we are coelomate. So here's what I'm talking about. So in here, there's, this is a flatworm, right? One of the flatworms I showed you before. They have the 3 tissues. They have the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, which is what you see in the blue, red, and yellow. But in the middle, this isn't a cavity. It's actually tissue that's filled in there. And so again, that tissue are made of cells, but cells have the intracellular fluid. Okay, but they're very simple. We're not going to see any organisms in here except for a tube that goes down the center of their body. That's the digestive tube. Anything, they're flat as well. So the diffusional distance is small from the environment into their body. So most things can still diffuse across their tissues and fulfill the needs inside of the organism. They do have a digestive tube down the middle, so they will bring food and digest it here and then absorb it in the other direction. Very simple organism. The next one is, I'm going to go to the coelomate because it's easier to, once you understand coelomate, than to understand acoelomate. Okay, so again, coelomate has the 3 tissues, the ectoderm, the endoderm, the yellow here, and then the mesoderm. And then this space here, this is the coelom, or the fluids-filled space. And so organs will float in that space. Okay. And what makes it a true coelom is that the mesoderm completely lines the cavity. So the outer portion of the cavity to the inner portion of the cavity completely lines it. So that's what makes it a true body cavity, or a coelom. Okay, so this is a very simple organism called an earthworm, right? Again, we're not showing the other organs in here right now, but they're there. Okay, here we are coelomate also. So this is what it would look like in a human. So here's our body cavity, all the space in here within the blue lines. So the blue lines are indicating the mesoderm. So we're lined on the outer portion as well as the inner portion. We have muscle associated with our organs. Okay, and then this is the fluids filled space. So our organs are actually floating around within the fluids filled space within your body cavity. Okay, again, this is going to help distribute nutrients and things like that. And then, but we're going to have a more complex situation going on too. More on that later. Here's pseudocoelomate. Pseudocoelomate, you can see they do have a cavity, a fluid-filled cavity. They've got the three tissue types, ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. But notice the difference. They only have the mesoderm lining on the outer portion of their body. It's not associated on the inner portion of the cavity or associated with any organs. So remember this, there's the inner lining. Compared to this, no inner lining. What's the difference? So what? Well, that muscle layer that's not associated here, so these organs have a muscle layer, so the organs can contract and do kind of put pressure on structures inside of there. So like our digestive system, all of those organs are lined by smooth muscle, so we can push and conduct food throughout the digestive system. So can this earthworm. Okay, this is what's called a roundworm, and the roundworm cannot actually, the organs themselves cannot conduct the food through their digestive tract. They actually have to wiggle their body around to put pressure on the fluid, which then puts pressure on the organ to put pressure on the food inside, and then the food can move through. Okay, so that's a pseudocoelomate organism. But again, mostly what I want you to get out of this right now is the fact that we have a fluid-filled body cavity. Okay, so now let's apply this to some animal groups, and we'll look at early animal groups. So what have we learned about cells that are multicellular, that form tissues, and then we'll start to get a hint of organs as well. Okay, so the first early animal groups, one are the sponges. We'll look at them first. These are animals whose cells are very loosely organized, but they actually don't have tissues. So the earliest animal group that we know of, they don't live colonially, but they do live multicellularly, but without tissues. And we'll also look at the next group of organisms called Cnidarians. So these are like your jellyfish and things. They're going to have 2 tissue layers. Okay, they won't have all 3 of the embryonic layers. They're only going to have the 2. So sponges first. So here's just a nice picture. You can see the variety of sponges that are out there. There's even more. So these are animals, early types of animals. You don't have to memorize the phylum yet, but I'm going to, like I've said before, introduce these terms so that it's going to make it easier at the end of the semester when you will be responsible for remembering that sponges are from the phylum Porifera. Okay. Sometimes you'll hear them just grouped in a unofficial classification called parazoa. And so parazoa means no tissues. Okay. So it's the oldest animal phylum. And again, no tissues. The cells are loosely organized with one another. Okay. But they're multicellular and there are different cell types. And these different cell types help to, we believed the cell signaling between them increase the coordination between the colonial cells. And so what happens then is these individual cells, again, they can't break off and live on their own. Okay, so they're not colonial, they are multicellular, but they form a more loose aggregation so that they're not forming tissues yet. Interesting fact about a sponge, you can break them down into their cellular components, like spin them around in a blender until you break up and you break apart all their cells into individual cells, and then put them, you have to have them in a watery medium, of course, and then they will reassemble and it'll regenerate itself. So that's a clue that tells us the individual cells can't live alone. They still need one another. So this is what they look like. So the main cell that I want you to realize that, again, sets this link to the choanoflagellate, and we believe we shared an ancestor with, is because they have cells that line the inside of their body cavity, and this is called a choanocyte. And again, is structurally and molecularly very similar to the choanoflagellates. Okay, so you have to remember that too. Choanoflagellate is a protist, single-celled organism. But now when we're talking about the similar cell type, those are called choanocytes. Okay, so these choanocytes, I mentioned, line the body cavity of sponges. The body cavity in a sponge is called a spongocoel. So it's not a true coelom because there are no tissues, right? A coelom is formed by those tissue layer types. Okay, so there are no tissues. So what they do is they call the space inside the spongocoel. But look, this is an organism that lives in the marine environment. So there's water on the outside. What it'll do is it'll draw water through little pores in its body called the ostium. Water will come in through the spongocoel and come out the opening, the large opening called the osculum. So that water flow brings nutrients with it. The choanocytes are lining the inside of the spongocoel. So as the nutrients, and these are microscopic nutrients, this guy does not have the ability to digest. There's no organs, right? No tissues, no organs. But each individual choanocyte, by flapping their flagellum around, draws the fluid in, and then the collar, the cytoplasmic tentacles can grab onto that food nutrient and draw it into the cell. Okay, and here are the other cells. Now there's amoebocytes that kind of cruise around within a protein that kind of it's the matrix that holds everything together. It's called the mesophyll or mesohyl. Okay, there's an outer covering of cells, the epithelial cells, right? And then to hold everything together, there are these structures in there called spicules. These are not cells. There are structures called spicules but the cells make them and secrete them. And this forms the scaffolding for the cells to adhere to and gives shape to the body, right? So it acts like a skeleton, but it's not really a skeleton because it's not tissue. Okay, but we can, some species are identified based on their spicules. So different species, they actually secrete and make different looking spicules. Okay, so again, what I want you to get out of this, early animal, it's multicellular but no tissues. What is its body cavity? Well, it's not a true body cavity. We call it a spongocoel, but it is a means to bring water so that water flows around all of the cells so that it can also then bring in the nutrients and the oxygen. Okay, there is some diffusion across the cells, but again, we're starting to get many cell layers in here. So we do need to conduct water not only on the outside, but the inside. But it's the choanocytes that are doing the main job to bring in nutrients and keep that fluid flowing. Okay, that's the sponges. So let's go to the next organism. One phylum is called the Cnidarians, and the other phylum are ctenophores. Later in the semester, we're only going to study Cnidarians. I might throw a little few ctenophores in there, but These are organisms that have a symmetry where all of their body structures are formed around a central axis. So we call that radial symmetry. And again, we'll really look at that later in the semester. Most of the organisms are marine, but what are cnidarians? These are called box jellyfish, other types of moon jellies, sea anemones, right? Portuguese man o' war. These are all different types of cnidarians. So again, you don't have to worry about these terms. We'll do that at the end of the semester. I just wanted to give you an idea of what we were looking at. So let's look at, again, its body plan and look at the cavities associated with it and relate that back to the tissue layers that we learned about. Now we have a multicellular organism whose cells form tissues. So this does have the embryonic germ layers, but they only form two. You've got the endoderm and the ectoderm. So the endoderm is lining the inside, and it's going to start to form digestive organs. The ectoderm is lining the outside of the structures, okay? And that's going to form the skin, the protective covering, or then there's also, we're going to start to see a rudimentary nervous system. So we have tissues now, we can start to see organs. What holds it all together is, again, a gel-like substance, what you see in yellow here called, I'm sorry, that's not the yellow. In between the yellow and, so in between the ectoderm and the endoderm, that's the mesoglea. So that's the gel-like structure that's kind of holding everything together, okay? And then notice now we have a very simple organ system. It's called the gastrovascular cavity. So the organism itself invaginates inward, forming a cavity for water to flow in to help distribute nutrients and gases and things, okay? And also what flows in is food. It doesn't necessarily have to be microscopic food, because this is also a digestive system. So the cells lining the gastrovascular cavity have the ability to secrete an enzyme to help break down food tissues. So this is extracellular digestion. Extra means outside of. It doesn't mean more. It means outside of. And so just like the fungi, what it's doing is it's secreting digestive juices outside of the cells into this cavity, and any food particles that are in there will get broken down. So we can actually now start to eat bigger pieces of food. A small fish can fit in here. And so through the digestive process, then the tissues of the fish get broken down into the molecules that can be absorbed across the endoderm and get to all the other cells within the body of the cnidarian here. Okay, and so again, we're seeing a double duty. It's a gastrovascular cavity. So gastro is the digestive part, and then the vascular, it's the fact that the fluid is flowing through here from the external environment. So water from the external environment helps to distribute the nutrients around. Water is a transport medium. Okay, and then the individual cells draw the nutrients across. Okay, the other thing that's important here is this gastrovascular cavity has only one opening. So food goes in the one opening, waste comes out the same opening. Okay, so it's both mouth and anus at the same time. Isn't that lovely? It is if you're a jellyfish. Okay, and so here you can see jellies can live, or cnidarians, I should say, can live in two forms. And so the form when it's sessile and attached to the bottom of the ocean, it's the polyp form, or attached to something else, that's called the polyp form. So it doesn't move, so we say it's sessile, S-E-S-S-I-L-E, sessile, okay? it can then break off from that attachment and then live in the water column, and it flips itself over and it lives as the Medusa stage. So this one can move around. It does not have the third embryonic layer, does not have mesoderm, so that means it can't produce muscle. So it doesn't have the ability to pull, but it does have cells that can contract a little bit. It's not true muscle though. So they can get a little bit of movement, right? So they can kind of move them, squish themselves, and it moves them through the water column, even in the polyp stage. So if this were a sea anemone and a crab fell on top, it would then automatically, it's sticky too, so it would grab it and contract. And these tentacles would contract toward the opening of the gastrovascular cavity, right? So it's going to assume it's got food and bring it down in there. If it doesn't have food, it can actually put pressure on the water and pop it out. Okay, so we'll learn later that cnidarians can live either as a polyp or as a medusa. Some live as both, and they have this cycle going around. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention, it has the ectoderm, so the outer covering, but we said it also can form a nervous system, and we do. We start to see nerve cells that just form a net, and it infuses around all of the structures of the organism. There's no central control organ, so there's no brain, so it's mainly just reacting, so the nerves can sense something, a pressure, and react to it, okay? And so that's what I was just describing to you. If a little crab falls on a tentacle here, it's the nerve net that senses it and then immediately causes the contraction, the pulling toward and in the middle. So again, if there were a central control organ like a brain, then there might be receptors here where then the brain can determine if it's food or a rock, right? Like our fingers will do. You can close your eyes and grab something and you can tell the shape and know what it is even without looking at it. Right, so these guys don't have the ability to do that. And it's all just based on touch and pull and react, right? So again, they're simple contractile cells. They're not true muscles though. And so later on we'll study muscles and see the mechanisms that are important inside of muscle cells. Okay, so again, relate. What do you know about cnidarians? They only have 2 tissue layers. Okay, so we went from our periphera to just multicellular and no tissue layers. Now we're in cnidarians, they have 2 tissue layers. Which ones are they? Endoderm and ectoderm. So now I might ask you, well, what organs they have? Well, if you know these 2 tissue layers, you're starting to know the organs. Has an endoderm, so there must be some type of digestive system, and it's a very primitive one called the gastrovascular cavity. Make sure you know how that works. Having an ectoderm, it has an outer protective covering, and so that outer protective covering limits the amount of oxygen that can diffuse across the tissues from the outside. So you got to bring water inside. But also the ectoderm produces a nerve system, right? And we see a nerve net in there. Okay, if I ever asked you on a test if this organism has muscles, well, you should know, in fact, well, what are the tissue types it has? It only has 2. It's missing the mesoderm, so no, it doesn't have muscles. Okay, all righty. So again, just more on that. I think I said all this in the previous slide, but here's the same thing written for you here. All righty, so that's it on our exploration of tissues and starting to look into organ systems within our Animalia. All righty, thanks everybody. Hope you enjoyed the show.